Thank you very much. What I'm proposing to do is introduce in three particular tools that we've used in the United Kingdom that you might find of interest, then again you might not. I'm going to start with a very short presentation on framing why it is we would use tools, and then I'm going to try and cover three different sets of tools. One which is a piece that we've used in order to help departments, line ministries, I'll come back to them, line ministries work in terms of delivering a government's ambition. The second is actually an analytical tool that we use to try and understand what's between the government and individual citizens. And the third one is about customer and citizens and how it is they engage with public services. Can you start by thinking about a policy area that you're interested in? One of the areas that your government is particularly concerned about. All right? This is not a tough task. All right? It may be something to do with children achieving at school, maybe to do with health, it may be to do with poverty, maybe to do with crime. Just identify one. This slide is going to just provide a framework, but in order to be able to frame why it is we're even talking about the tools, I want to just share with you some of my thoughts in terms of a performance framework that actually begins with outcomes. How does your government sets its priorities? In the United Kingdom, we set those priorities. We did set those priorities for 3 years. We're now extending that to 4 and 5 years, and our budget reflects that. But essentially, if everything is a priority, nothing's a priority. Now, that set of priorities doesn't actually get delivered by people like us. We set the policies, as here in terms of government, but there'll be a whole range of non-government people who will also be involved. All right? And in a very real sense, the people that really matter, all right, is what I describe as our delivery partners. If you think of the public service that you were concerned about, that might be a teacher, it might be a firefighter, it might be a range of different people. What really mostly matters is what it is they do with individual citizens. So that's the first line. The first line is how a government establishes its priorities and then communicates its priorities to everyone who's involved in the public service. The second tool I'll be sharing with you today is a means of analyzing that. The second is how that actually relates to budget. The way in which, in those multiple years, all right, the budget is set up in order to reflect what it is the government's priorities are. Now that might sound a silly statement, and I've looked at a number of your individual countries and I realize it is something that many of you are actually working on. The very close alignment between what it is the programs are that are being put in place, the objectives, and where it is the money actually goes to. The only way to know whether or not citizens are getting good value for money is the interrelationship between those two. The third is about accountability. And I've put up there accountability with consequences. Because unless there are consequences, all you have is a system. I was talking to a colleague a minute ago about a system in one of the African countries that I'm working in, which has a very clear set of priorities and a clear set of accountabilities, but none of it has any consequences. So all it is a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of administration that doesn't make any difference much to individual citizens. And in the United Kingdom, we have accountability in a variety of ways, and it's accountability of the Prime Minister, it's accountability within individual institutions, and it's accountability within our delivery partners for individuals. And then finally, all right, the fourth element of the framework is how it is you build capacity, you monitor and build capacity to ensure these other three things work, and how you ensure that what's actually happening within individual citizens is actually feeding back into the policy process, and how it is you ensure that the people who are involved have the skills and have the ability to actually make that difference. And so particularly the focus is going to be about how it is we help the system, all right, make sure that they're getting the right outcomes for citizens. All of what I'll be talking about in terms of all of the various tools are based on a view about delivery, about making sure that there's a relationship between government ambition and what actually happens on the ground. But there are four elements to it. The first is about leadership, ensuring that there's a clear view, there's an alignment, as I was saying a minute ago, between what it is the government's ambitions are and the people who are actually going to do something about it. The second is about whether or not ministries are clear what it is they're doing and clear about the way in which they're working together. In the second tool we'll be looking at today, which is looking at delivery systems, the argument that I'll be putting to you is that individual ministries, what an individual, your Department of Education, your Department of Health, or your Department of Justice, what they do is important, but the way in which they work together is equally important, because from an individual citizen's point of view, they don't much care about the departmental structure. What they care about is the quality of the services they receive and the extent to which they live in a safe community and are able to actually meet their own ambitions. The third is ensuring that we understand what works and making sure that all of the people who are involved in making it work are working together. And then finally, what from all of the research that I've done about your individual countries, you are well on the way in terms of, and well, very sophisticated in terms of what you're looking at, are looking at the way in which you use metrics. That's quite key in terms of making the system work. What does that actually mean? Is that you need to understand delivery. And delivery has, in our experience, 6 particular elements to it in terms of really judging it. And basically what I've done is I've just selected out the 6 headings. All right? It is about clarity of vision. It is about being clear what outcomes you're looking to achieve. It is about making sure you've set priorities so that priorities really are priorities. It is about effective performance, program management, risk management, what we would describe as good governance. It's about effective delivery partner and engagement with the people who are delivering systems. So clarity about visions, all right, priorities, incentives, resources, responsibilities throughout the chain, partner engagement, governance, all right, and performance management, risk management. If you have those in your head, all right, and you will see in a minute in terms of the tools that I'll be talking about, that's what will drive this. And whatever you do in terms of your delivery structure, in my view, you need to be clear about what those criteria actually are, what it is, the basic underlying philosophy that you're pursuing in terms of goods delivery. But the 2 other elements, which are actually quite important as underlying, all right? The first, all right, is making sure that you've got approaches, all right, that enable you to analyze those. And I'm using the word tool in a particular way here this morning. The tool I'm saying is a sequence of methods. It's not complicated, this. It's a sequence of methods which enable you to solve problems. All right? You need them because the challenge we all have, and that's true for us all, although some of us have particular financial crises, but it needs to be, as I say, within the context of the definitions you have for delivery, all right, and the definitions you have in terms of reform. Now, in the United Kingdom, we've begun to define our reform program in a slightly different way than we had done previously. We've defined our reform program on the basis of three different elements. The first is actually empowering citizens in a way that we've not empowered them before. So rather than everything being driven by the state, all right, engaging citizens in a very different sort of way. And the best example I have is one of the basic problems is antisocial behavior on our streets. Now that's partly about what our police force does, but it's equally about what individual citizens do. And we need to engage our citizens in a different way that we've done previously. It's similarly true in terms of education. All right? We know the evidence is very clear that what parents do with their children is substantially more important than what individual schools do. And yet we don't engage our parents in quite the same way. Similarly, all right, we're looking at the way in which our teachers, our nurses, our doctors, our police officers, the extent to which we enable them and empower them to do the job that they need to do. We've gone through in the United Kingdom a period of reform where everything was defined very clearly from the center. We now think it's right, and there was a good reason for that, we now think it's right to open up the system slightly more. And we're looking at ways in which we can empower frontline professionals. And then finally, there's the role of the government itself and the extent to which the government, as I say, drives reform and the extent to which the government enables reform. Now the second, which again is embedded in everything that I'll be talking about this morning and tomorrow, right, is a clear view in terms of an approach to delivery. It is my view, all right, that metrics matter. That in order to know whether or not you're making progress, you need to measure it. And in my view, that's as much about setting trajectories in terms of the progress that you're making on each of your programs. Now, there's an argument that says, all right, you don't fatten the pig by weighing it. You don't fatten the pig by weighing it. And that's very true. On the other hand, if you don't weigh it, you don't know if it's getting fatter. And so in a very real sense, a lot of what I'll be talking about is predicated on good metrics and a real understanding of what's happening out there. And then finally, the element that, in terms of the final piece of this jigsaw, is a view that delivery is enhanced by systematic intervention. What you have there is just really an indication of what my previous unit, the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, the structure of what it is we spent our time on. We had four major tasks. We had overall responsibility for the performance policy and the way in which that first slide that I used, those four elements came together. We also had responsibility for capacity building across government departments. And we also had responsibility for monitoring performance. But the real focus is our work primarily was about unblocking delivery obstacles, using the data that we'd collected in terms of performance, and then systematically intervening to do something about it. And the tools that I'll be sharing with you this morning are all about ways in which we did that. Now, what that does is provide a basis, all right, for us to actually begin to look at how it is tools are created. And quite simply, before I introduce the first tool, quite simply, all right, the structure of a tool is being very clear about the problem you're going to solve, researching it, analyzing what that research tells us, turning that into new knowledge, and then giving some recommendations about what you would do differently. So the thrust of what I'm arguing, all right, is that having identified what it is you want to look at, what it is your ambition is, having monitored the extent to which you're successfully meeting that ambition, the task really is to use delivery tools in order to be able to improve, enhance the delivery by unblocking whatever the problems actually are. The first tool, all right, is about what I describe as preparing for delivery. All right, where you might want to use this tool, all right, is when you're working with a line ministry, having identified a need for them to deliver something to a set of citizens. And it might be in a particular region, it might be across the country as a whole, but essentially you have, from the center of government, a concern about the extent to which the system is actually ready for the delivery of whatever that ambition is. So it's about identifying through collaboration the underlying barriers to delivery, which might increase the prospects to secure your government's priorities. All right? Now, what's required? What's required is a set of criteria that would enable you to make that judgment. But you then need to, all right, having established what criteria you'd be using to make that judgment, you then need an approach to collecting evidence about the extent to which the department or the ministry is prepared to do that delivery, an approach to synthesizing that evidence, and some sort of an agreement about what sort of report. Now, this particular tool, and all of the tools that I'll be sharing with you today, are all short, sharp pieces of work. They're all 4 weeks, 6 weeks, certainly no longer than 8 weeks. And we would normally be looking for these to be used in a 4-week period. And this particular one is definitely. So it works out of the basis of an 80-20 rule, all right? That actually you could spend 6 months, but actually from our experience, you don't get much more than what you get, assuming you've got the basis and the foundation of it's right. Hence what I was describing earlier on in terms of a clear view of delivery and a clear view in terms of reform. All right? The overview of this particular tool, bearing in mind I described as collaborative, this is not something, and we used to use these tools in an uncollaborative basis, but we found that much more powerful if you're actually working with departments. Very straightforward, all right? You begin by building a review team, both within the center and across the department. You then do a self-assessment. You then do field work, and I'll only refer to that later on this morning. You do some analysis, and then you report. All right? Very straightforward, all within a 4-week period. I'm going to be suggesting that these are the criteria that you might want to think about. These are the sort of criteria that I would be suggesting that we've used on a variety of different exercises. You may want to amend those against your own context, and that would be true against all of the tools. There are 4 elements in terms of this particular tool. Remember, the focus is on whether or not a ministry is prepared for delivery. The first is vision and leadership. The second is working across ministries. The third is the delivery system. And the fourth is performance and program management. Now, I hope you can see they relate to what I was saying a minute ago in terms of what we believe rather matters in terms of the key elements of delivery. The questions that we have in here, is there a clear and compelling, coherent vision of what success looks like? Is there a clarity across that? Is there leadership at both national and local level? Both of those are important if you take my argument that delivery is not just about national ambition, but actually happens with individual teachers, nurses, and so on. Is there clarity of who's responsible within the ministry? All right? One of the key issues that we've found over the years is there wasn't. The ministry as a whole would identify an ambition, and one of the central challenges within our system is that civil servants, the ministry officials, very often make their careers on the basis of new policy, not on the basis of whether or not a policy that's been in existence actually is delivered to individual citizens. That's a really rather important bit of learning for us. And so one of the things we've tried to center on is there clarity within the ministry of who's responsible for educational achievement at age 12? Is there a senior official who's responsible for that? And finally, is there regular communication between of the vision, all right, between the ministry and all the people who are supposed to do something about it? Using the education example, we wanted to raise standards of literacy at age 11. There was a senior official who was responsible for it. Had we communicated to all of our schools, all of our parents, and all of our communities that that's what we wanted? The second, in terms of the delivery system, is there shared understanding throughout in terms of what works, who's responsible, and what the levers are. It's really important in my view, to ensure that policy is based on evidence and practice of what works. Is there a clear understanding, both at ministerial level and at the front line, what that evidence actually says? Are the delivery partners clear about and agree to what it is their role is in terms of meeting the government's ambition? If the teachers in our schools aren't committed to improving literacy standards, then they're unlikely to improve. Are delivery partners capable? Do they have the skills to do it? One of the things that we learned some years ago, the central problem with our efforts on literacy is too many of our teachers weren't trained in the new understanding about child's development and the way children learn. So we had a major program of in-service training, continuing professional training for all of our teachers, literally all of our teachers who were teaching teaching reading. Is there an active engagement with citizens in terms of what works and what it is they want? Communication with that, ensuring that they are playing their part. As I said a minute ago, we know that, again, sticking with that education example, we know that what parents do is significantly more important than what schools do. Thirdly, reasonably more straightforward, is there effective plan of action? Are people actually managing the program, knowing what we know about good program management? Is there good, high quality, timely, and I underline the timely there, performance information? One of the key challenges we've had in a number of policy areas is that our feedback loops, we didn't get enough data about performance on a regular basis, which meant that and education, the example I'm using is a good one. We only tested children nationally once a year, so we needed to put in place proxies to enable us to know what sort of progress we were making. Is there an alignment with the incentives, and are the right skills and resources in place, not just at the front line, but across the delivery system? The next tool will help us on that. And finally, working across ministries, is the goal prioritized at national level across ministries? One of the key challenges we learned in our various iterations of our public service agreements is that if children don't show up at school socially, emotionally, and physically ready to learn, they won't learn. So if they've not actually eaten, they've not had breakfast, they're not actually secure, they're unlikely, to actually have a good day at school. And so we needed to get our health ministry and our culture ministry doing things differently. Is there a structure to enable the government departments to work together, to work across ministries? Is there cooperation and teamwork across officials? And is there a way in which they can actually take the difficult decisions that they need to take? That's the criteria I would be suggesting. And again, they're listed in the slides that you've got, that I'm suggesting works for us. So the logic of this is actually just as his colleagues were saying, is actually looking at the criteria and establishing whether or not the criteria are right. All right? And in the answer, how would you know, I thought what was interesting is some of you actually knew already. You were able to look at the questions and say, well, hang on a minute, we don't know enough about one of the criteria, another criteria. Now, I would urge you, in terms of the way we've used the tool, all right, not to immediately to leap to those judgments, but to actually ask yourself and challenge yourselves, where would you get the evidence to know whether or not your natural instinct is right or wrong? And what I've included on that, and again, I think that's in the pack, is actually, trying to find what sort of issues you'd be looking at, where you would actually look for, and what sort of information you might want to find. So the extent to which people are actually managing their stakeholders, engaging with users, how it is the ministries are actually working within the system. But actually what that looks like is, the point I'm making is really try and do some field work. All right, structure it in a way. The questions themselves are good. I like to think are good questions. And the ministries, when we use this, the ministries were very, very engaged with it and found exactly what some of you found. That some of the things they were good at, some of the things they had gaps in terms of what it is they were doing. Once they'd done the self-assessment, to really get deeper into looking at what their documents said, all right, going out and interviewing, all right, if what matters is what individual teachers and doctors, and go out and interview them, visit them, find out what it is they think about the government's policy. Run workshops for them, both within the ministries, but also with other people, the people who are actually providing the services. Now, once you've done that, the logic of this tool is you then do an analysis and come up with sets of recommendations that might actually be helpful, all right, to actually improving the quality against any one of those quadrants, what it is the ministry is actually doing with any one of those quadrants. But as you're designing the way in which you might use this tool, I'd urge you to be very careful in terms of who it is you're going to report to, all right, and what action would be required. So, for example, we did this work, and the report went, on each of the ones we did, a report went to the Prime Minister. Now, that had consequences, all right, because the department would be very concerned about what it is the Prime Minister might think of their department. That was partly good news and partly bad news. All right? People are nodding, so they completely recognize what the dynamic of that is. It was good news because it meant it had traction. And because the report went to the Prime Minister, the departments did something about it because they wanted to be seen to improve. It had other consequences in terms of the integrity and the work that we did. Now, I'll just briefly go through this. In terms of the field work, the approach we took was what I described as hypothesis-led. They did a self-assessment, the departments did a self-assessment, and my own team did an assessment. And sometimes they were the same, sometimes they weren't the same. But before we went out to do the field work, we identified through desk research, through building issues trees by workshops, what it is we would want to look at in terms of lines of inquiry. We then went out and looked at what the system, how the system was performing, and identified what the main obstacles were through interviews, frontline observation, and then of course we reached a judgment using a variety of different tools, But again, All right, when we get to the final report and actions, all right, you need to be very, very specific. You need to ensure that whatever the recommendations that you're making will be enough to have sufficient impact on improving the delivery. You need to make sure that they're proportionate. It's very easy in these sorts of reports, all right, to come up with lots of recommendations. I was always of the view a fewer number of more important recommendations were more likely to make progress than lists and lists of recommendations and actions. You need to be specific and clear. They need to be measurable. They need to have clear ownership. And most importantly, they need to, as it were, help fix the system, not be quick fixes. In a very real sense. Now, these are the sorts of things that are the cut and thrust of all of the evaluation that you do in each of your countries. So I suspect that's really very much what people are aware of. Now, what I suggest is we stop, pick up a quick coffee, and then we'll go into the next tool. So this particular tool, which is called delivery mapping, is about an understanding of the roles, responsibilities, the motivations. And if you think about it, you've got a government ambition, all right? The ambition, the goals, the priorities of a government. And you've got citizens. All right? And in between, all right, you have a range of people, all right? Each of those blobs is a people, is a person. And each of those people has their own motivations, has their own skills, has their own interests. And what this is intended to do is help us understand how it is government can intervene, all right, and make sure that there's an alignment in terms of what we're doing. All right, and again, what's required is an approach which I'll take you through, a way of analyzing, a way of gathering evidence, and so on. Now, the delivery system is a network of organizations that need to work together to improve outcomes for local people. So a range of organizations, and included within those organizations are individuals, as I say, with their motivations. They need to work together to improve outcomes. This includes central government, local government, other public sector partners, and in our case, we use the words partners from the third and private sectors. So private companies, as well as voluntary organizations, civic society. And it's about ensuring all of those groups are working together to achieve the government's ambitions. In terms of a delivery system, there are four key questions. The first is which organizations have a role in delivering whatever the goal is. The second, are all of those organizations effectively contributing to that goal? And we looked at some of the criteria in the previous tool. The third is if they're not, what's preventing them from contributing? And the fourth is if they're not, how you can improve what it is they're actually doing. There are three stages to this. The first is actually coming up with a map, identifying who needs to do what, who the actors are, and what their roles and responsibilities are. The second is analyzing it, and the third is then doing something about that analysis. Very straightforward and very linear. Included within a delivery system is a clarity about what the government's ambition is. You'll see there's a theme running through here. All right, establishing how the money flows through the system. And in our case, very often, as I'll show in a minute, money gets wasted at various points in the delivery system. The nature of the relationships, the accountability between all of the various organizations, what gets in the way, and how it is ultimately they work with citizens. Now, In terms of our thinking, we've moved from, you'll see in a lot of the literature, you'll see in Michael Barber's book and a range of other documentation, reference to delivery chains. And that was where we originally started in our thinking some years ago. And it was a view that it was a straight, linear set of relationships, and that if somehow you pulled a lever in central government, the individual citizen somehow would feel the difference. And there was a direct, simple line relationship. In our case, our Department of Health had at regional level what we called strategic health authorities. So the regional bodies who commissioned services from hospitals and general practitioners. You then had local government in our health system, which had responsibility for public health, not acute health, but public health in terms of raising the profile in terms of what individual citizens did themselves. You then had hospitals and general practitioners, third sector organizations on drug abuse or other sorts of health-related activities. And then you had citizens. And our original thinking was there was a direct line, and somehow if we aligned all of those, the system would work. We've now moved to a view which is actually predicated on the notion of a delivery system rather than a delivery chain. This may just be a bit too subtle, but time will tell. And the delivery system starts from an individual citizen. So we've moved from our delivery chains, which started at what government did, from a delivery system which started from what it looks like from a citizen's point of view. And in this particular example I'm using, one of the central problems that we have in the United Kingdom is childhood obesity. And so if you look at an individual child, probably the biggest influence is what it is their parents do, what is the family does. Although a recent survey in the United Kingdom, actually a few years ago now, asked parents who they thought was responsible for childhood obesity, and not surprisingly, they said the family. When they said who was to blame, they said the government. But also in terms of that system, the individual child will have their school around them. In our case, an elementary school, a primary school, and a secondary school. There may be others if the child moves around. And of course, we'll have a relationship with the general practitioners and hospitals. What the tool does is basically ask us to identify the national, the regional, and the local actors, the local parts of this system. The Department of Health has a set of relationships with regional bodies, local bodies, and patients. And what this tool does is encourage you to, from the Department of Health, follow the money to the various organizations that play a part, think about whether or not their performance managed by them, what the relationships are, and think about how they relate to the various patients. That's just the Department of Health. If you add, in our case, the Department of Communities and Local Government, you have a different set of organizations that work on exactly those issues. And then if you add the other government departments, in terms of better health for all, you have the Department of Health, Department of Communities, Department for Education, Department of Welfare and Pensions, the Home Office, which is in terms of crime and justice, culture, media, sport, and so on. And essentially what delivery system mapping does is helps you to identify each of the various players, what the relationships are between each of the various players, and begins to set the foundation for you to ask the question, do all of these people and organizations have the same motivation to achieve the government goal, in this case, better health for all. Now, the components of the best plans are being very clear about the outcomes, what it is, and the more specific, the better. You will see if I go back, better health for all, because it's health across a broad range, becomes much more generic. If you actually broke that down to childhood obesity, you would eliminate some of these and be more specific. Be very clear in terms of the customer groups, childhood obesity being individual children as opposed to the population as a whole. Be very clear about the delivery partners, who it is it's doing the providing. Be clear about the nature and the type of the links between them, and I've taken out, because it was out of date, the actual flow of funding, where the money goes. Starting with the Department of Health in terms of funding flows, because of the complexity of our system, what matters in terms of individual citizens will be what our general practitioners and our hospitals actually do. What this map actually did for us, all right, so they were the people who are going to be relating to patients. If you used a school example, it would be the school who would be local, would be the individual teachers who would be relating to children. If you look at crime, it would be individual police officers who would be relating to citizens on the street or in their homes. Ultimately, you want to maximize that. So what this map did for us when we originally drew it is ask questions: how much money is being spent here and here particularly that actually isn't effectively contributing to what's going on there? Monies here do add value, but very often get wasted because they're not focused enough. Now, equally true for all of the others. A complete version of a delivery system map would actually have both public sector organizations, inspectorates, regulatory bodies, private sector organizations. In the United Kingdom, many public services are increasingly being provided by private businesses rather than by the state. That's a direction of travel that we're on. Voluntary sector organizations, civil society, and then of course you have the users. It's important to get a clarity in terms of direct accountability, all right, whether or not it's a contracted relationship, whether or not it's just wider influence, but you begin to build up a picture, all right, of what it looks like. Now that's education, training, and employment. Another example for 16 to 19-year-olds. In our case, now the final years of school. Just picking up the point I was making there. You have at national level, the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, Department for Education, Department for Work and Pensions. This is 16 to 19-year-olds, and in our case currently, the major concern is actually here, because they handle unemployment. And it's the extent to which when a 16 to 18-year-old is unemployed, the extent to which we are effectively picking them up and bringing them back into the education system. Our schooling age is currently 16. It's going up to 18 in a couple of years' time. Now, you will see here various national and regional organizations, local organizations that play their part, and you can begin to see the interrelationships, and again, the money can, you can actually map the way the money actually flows. Again, in this example, because of our concern about unemployment, a lot of it revolves around what businesses do. So by drawing this map, what it highlights for the ministry is that just dealing with the government departments and the way in which they work won't be sufficient to unblock the delivery problem of our need for new jobs. both new jobs with and without training. And when we drew this map, what it showed is that the interrelationship between the government departments and those new businesses on this particular issue was insufficient. And we needed to do more to build it up. There's another example in terms of crime. The major departments that handle crime in the UK, and again, you might be surprised at some of these. Inevitably, the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, which is handles all of the police, relates to all of the police. Our Department for Communities and Local Government, in terms of what happens in our communities and the extent to which individual communities take responsibility, for example, for antisocial behavior, or what actually happens within their local neighborhoods. The Department for Education, in terms of ways in which they build a new set of relationships, new set of understandings amongst children, and these are the ones that might surprise you. The Department of Health, which has a huge contribution because the correlation evidence on an evidence basis between the people who are ultimately going to be in our prisons, that's Ministry of Justice, very often have health-related conditions. People who are going to be in our prisons very often are going to be children who have been taken into care, taken away from their parents. And then finally, the relationship with the Department for Business and Innovation and Skills, skills being a major partner within all this. And again, what does manufacturers do in terms of, for example, what is our car manufacturers did in relation to car security? What is our mobile phone? Our biggest problem at the minute is mobile phone theft. Working with our manufacturers in terms of creating products that will actually in themselves deter crime. And so basically by being inclusive and drawing out all of the various players within a delivery system, you begin to build up a very different sort of picture about what it looks like. The work we're doing in Colombia has been around housing, in terms of housing supply. Now, once you've actually drawn those maps, again, you have a bit of research to do about understanding what the implications of them are. And it's much exactly the same as the research I was referring to earlier on. And again, these are sorts of exercises that happen within weeks, not months. Desk research, identifying lines of inquiry, getting out and seeing what's actually happening. This is quite a key component of actually delivery system work. At the end of the day, a delivery system works because the people out there are motivated to do what the government wants or not, and you need to understand what this looks like from their point of view. And then finally, coming to some sort of a judgment, making some sort of recommendations. In terms of checking the analysis, simple scoring system, which enables you to, is the outcome clear? Again, you'll see the consistency between the original slide I was using on delivery. Is the outcome clear? Is sufficient capacity? Are roles and responsibilities clear? Are staff committed? Does the system use robust and timely data? And are the levers and incentives fit for purpose? Now, let me stop, ask you within your pairs not to focus on a policy issue, focus on the tool, and ask yourself, does the process of mapping a delivery system in that sort of way have any sort of relevance to your country? Are there particular priorities in your country where it might be useful to understand and do the analysis in this sort of way and identify how you might apply the approach? Just focusing on the process, not going into the policy area, just identifying whether or not the tool has any relevance whatsoever to you. Let me just very quickly then share in the last few minutes one final tool. It is about delivery from the citizen perspective, and it is something you have gathered, I feel very strongly about, and we've learned quite a lot about over recent years. And this is again, a tool which is called customer journey mapping. It is actually about, and I've got some problem with customer, but I put it there. Sometimes we use customer journeys, sometimes we use citizen journeys. One of the problems that we've had in the United Kingdom is that we developed our public services in a way that encouraged our citizens to think they were customers, that they didn't have the right responsibility. We had the balance between their rights and their responsibilities, quite frankly, a bit wrong. And so they started thinking that they were entitled to anything they wanted, anytime they wanted it, rather than they had a responsibility as well in terms of whatever the services were. But essentially the thrust of this particular tool is about using the perspective of the customer, the citizen, as really the focus. And it's about showing how different groups have different requirements, how revealing pressure points using a journey map, and then identifying, in much the same way we were talking about in terms of the delivery system, what it is that mapping, finding a visual way in which you can represent that analysis. And so the objective on this one is to understand what public services are like from a citizen's point of view, all right, and to analytically track their experience. Now, it is about, all right, describing the experience that individual citizens or customers have as they interact with our services, as they actually engage within our services. And it has three particular components to it. One, focusing on the emotional insight of an individual citizen as they work through. Now, this has other benefits, not least of which is about public satisfaction, which in our government, because any public service is an agreement between taxpayers and the government, there's been a particular focus in terms of the satisfaction, particularly as our taxes have gone up because of the financial crisis and because people are concerned about getting good value for money out of each of their services. The second element is about process mapping, mapping the system in terms of showing, as I'll show you in a second, what it looks like if you're a citizen trying to access one of our services, and then actually, as always, trying to measure the experience to begin to quantify and to begin to think about it in a harder sort of way. Now, the first step is to actually segment your citizens, segment the customers, all right? And you can do that in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it might be about the demographic, sometimes it might be geographic. Citizens in our rural communities have a very different experience of our health services, our education services, our criminal justice services than those people who live in our cities. Quite frankly, some people who live in our inner cities have a different sort of experience. But you could also segment people by what it is they do, how much they might spend, the way people live in terms of how they might use a service, when they might experience a service. So again, different people will experience going back to health, our health services in a particular sort of way. Our elderly will have a very significant sort of experience in terms of access to our health economy than our youth would do. The third is how people think and how they feel. All right? We have a range of citizens who wouldn't want to use public services, who wouldn't want to admit they needed public services. On the other hand, there are people who would use everything as often as they can. And it would also be the case because of their needs. In the United Kingdom, in each of our communities, all right, if you talk to local people, social workers, teachers, nurses, they would be able to identify for you the 20 or 30 families who access all of our services all of the time. They're the same group of families that all of our services will be involved in one way or another. They have very different sort of a need, very different sort of experience. Quite frankly, cost the taxpayer a significant sum of money. And then, of course, there's a combination of all of those. So what is a customer journey map? All right? What you've got there is a customer journey map. I'm going to make it a bit more legible for you, just in case you're visually challenged by this. All right? This is a customer journey map, the entire customer journey map. It was a particular concern when the financial crisis hit in the United Kingdom. The government was very concerned about an increasing number of people who were losing their homes, who were having their homes repossessed. And we wanted to know, the government put in place a range of stimulus measures that would actually support people. They'd agreed with the banks, they agreed with local citizen advice agencies, they'd agreed with the courts how it is we would handle that to try and actually support people who were undergoing the crisis. And so what you saw here was an approach that enabled all of the different agencies, if you looked at it from a citizen's point of view, if you were an individual who was in danger of having your home repossessed, of losing your house because you'd lost your job or because you'd hit financial circumstance. All right? These are the range of different agencies that might have been involved with you. And the logic of this tool is to identify an individual, who they might contact, and what their experience would be. Now, we got to understand this by a range of techniques, including, for example, mystery shopping. So I found myself one day going into one of our banks and saying we were in danger of losing our house. And did they have anything? The government put in place a whole range of programs that were being made available to the banks, and I wanted to know whether or not they were being, and I said I was in danger of losing my house. Is there anything they could do to help me? Tragically, they had no idea what they could do to help me. So clearly what we found was that the government program was not actually playing out. All right? So again, it's looking at it from a citizen's point of view. If you went to one of our citizens' advice bureaus, which is very often a first step for people, did they know enough about all of the different, if you went to your local authority, they were quite keen in terms of helping you. Did they refer you to somebody else? Did you get referred to 2 or 3 different people? And so basically what we did is we mapped the journey of a range of different people in terms of what it looked like. We mapped the system, all right, in terms of what it looks like from an individual citizen's point of view. We built an end-to-end process. So if I started with a problem, how was it I was going to resolve the problem? It was no good talking to lots of people. At the end of the day, if I was trying to avoid losing my house, that's the end outcome that we were after. All right? What did that actual process look like end to end? And again, the only way you can do that is actually getting out there and talking to people. And what we identified, again, I'll use this example, is a range of different steps on, and similar on most things. The first is developing an awareness, I know I've got a problem. Then an acceptance that I've got a problem, I need to do something about it. People then started to investigate how it is they could get help. And this was similar, this is, again, the repossession, but it's similar across a range of them. They then began to engage with whatever those organizations were. Now, more often than not, it's here that it became more difficult, because they started to engage and it didn't actually resolve their problem. They kept getting sent to different sorts of agencies rather than getting their problem resolved in an efficient manner. They then reviewed whether or not it was getting resolved, getting to a view of what the decisions were, responding to it, and then ultimately getting the appropriate support. The logic being, you're following it all the way through, from the beginning of a citizen with a problem to the end, I'm getting the outcome that I actually require. Now, if you thought of a service, how easy would you find accessing that service? If you think about one of the key public services that you've got within your country, how easy it to access it? Are there blockages? Are there overlaps? Do you actually know? Do you get the feedback? And how do you actually resolve all that? But let me just make a couple of final observations. The logic of what I've tried to share with you this morning is that approaching problems of public service delivery in a systematic way enables us all to actually unblock whatever the obstacles are that actually are being experienced by citizens and the people that are actually paying for those services. And it seems to me there are a couple of very key components in terms of some of the lessons that we've learned in using these tools over a number of years. The first is that outcomes matter. That actually by focusing on what outcomes the government is after, which hopefully is what citizens actually want, that's why they were elected, that's where you start and you finish in terms of an approach to public service delivery. The second is that the skills and dynamics of delivery, of what's actually happening out there, can actually be analyzed, can actually be understood in a different sort of way. And it is my view that government has a responsibility to understand that. And from everything I've seen within your own countries, that's shared. The third is that the basics of good delivery, which I shared with you at the beginning, are key. You need to have a view what comprises good delivery and what reform program, what view of public services you and your individual country, and it is contextual, are actually taking. But once you've taken those views, what's key is that there's a consistency and an alignment of all of the various actors, all the various partners who are actually involved in the delivery of those services. But as sure as night follows day, it won't always work. And when it doesn't work, there needs to be an approach, a systematic approach, that enables you, on behalf of taxpayers, to intervene and to improve what is actually happening out there. In our case, it was the delivery unit and departmental units and a variety of others. There needs to be a way government should intervene to improve what's happening out there. At the end of all of that, a collaborative approach is going to pay more dividends than any other, and that involving citizens in this endeavor is actually also seriously important in terms of making it work. Thank you very much for at least taking part. My email is there, so if you want to carry on the dialogue even after the next few days, I'd be delighted to continue to engage with you about this. At the end of the day, all of our countries share the same challenge. We're collecting taxes in order to provide quality public services that actually meet the needs of our citizens in our communities. And the more we can learn from each other, and I really look forward to spending the next couple of days learning from you, the more we can learn from each other, the more likely we'll be able to serve our citizens the way they deserve. So thank you very, very much. Delightful to meet you, and look forward to working with you next couple of days. Thanks very much.